You're a widow. Stop clinging to the past like a child who never grew up, my father said. He'd just sold my late husband's lake cabin, the one he built with his own 2 hands, and given every dollar to my brother for his dream marina. My brother laughed and said at least it had finally done something useful, while I was 1,000 miles away and couldn't stop a single signature. I set down my fork and smiled, because I already knew exactly what that marina was about to cost him. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 35 years old, and while I was gone 4 months appraising hurricane wreckage along the Florida coast, my parents sold the lakeside cabin my late husband built with his own hands and gave every dollar to my brother for a marina he calls his dream. I found out at dinner. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a text with a warning emoji. A Saturday evening casserole at my parents' house in Laconia, New Hampshire. Steam curling off the dish like nothing in the world was wrong. My father, Glenn Calloway, 63 and retired from 30 years running the municipal water department, sat at the head of the table the way he always did, like the chair came with a gavel. He raised his glass of iced tea and looked directly at me. You're a widow now, Nora. Stop holding on to a pile of lumber like it's going to bring him back. My mother placed her hand over mine. Diane Calloway, 61, part-time secretary at the Baptist Church on Route 11, had a voice that could slide from comfort to guilt without changing pitch. She squeezed my fingers gently, as if tenderness could make the theft feel like a gift. We only want what's best, sweetheart. You know that. Across the table, my brother leaned back in his chair with a grin that looked borrowed from a boat show brochure. Kyle Calloway, 31, newly minted marina operations manager, tanned in a way that suggested weekends on a deck rather than decades on a dock. He tilted his glass toward me. Look, at least the place finally did something useful for the family. You need to understand something about my family. They don't steal from you with malice. They steal from you with absolute moral certainty that they deserve it more. My father genuinely believed he was doing me a favor. My mother genuinely believed her casserole made it kind. And my brother genuinely believed that his ambition was more important than my dead husband's last piece of earth. Because Kyle has believed that about every room he has ever walked into. The cabin sat on Lake Winslow in Moulton Borough. Everett bought the lot 6 years ago, the worst parcel on the water, clay soil, and a slope that every other buyer had passed on twice. He built the cabin himself, weekends and evenings after his carpentry jobs, because he said, a house you build with your own hands can't lie to you about what it's made of. He was a Finnish carpenter. He noticed everything. He noticed the cracks before anyone, and he started saving money to fix them. And then he fell from a scaffold in October of 2021 and left me the cabin and his notebook and nothing else. I inherited it through right of survivorship. My name was on the deed. My name was the only name on the deed. And while I was in Florida, crawling through attics full of black mold and writing damage estimates for strangers, my father used a limited power of attorney I'd given him for mail and bills, signed closing documents he had no authority to sign, sold the cabin for $248,000 to a cash buyer who never ordered an inspection, and wired every cent to Calloway Marina LLC, which was Kyle's company, which was Kyle's dream, which was the reason I was now sitting at a dinner table being told to let go. Have you ever watched someone brag about spending money that still has your dead husband's fingerprints on it? Kyle talked about slip fees and fuel margins while I ate rosemary casserole and breathed through my nose. He talked about a charter boat partnership. He talked about how the marina was going to put this family on the map. He said the word family 11 times in 4 minutes. I counted. I set my fork down on the plate. Very precisely, tines aligned with the edge of the ceramic. The sound was small and clean, like a period at the end of a sentence. And then I laughed. Not bitter, not broken. The quiet laugh of a woman who appraises damaged houses for a living and knows exactly what the ground beneath that cabin does when it rains. Kyle stopped mid-sentence. What the hell is so funny? I was just wondering, I said. Who'd be foolish enough to buy that cabin without checking what's underneath it first? The table went cold. Glenn's jaw tightened. Diane pulled her hand away from mine. Kyle looked at our father, then back at me, and for 1/2 second his grin slipped, and I saw something behind it that looked like the beginning of math he hadn't done yet. "You always were the dramatic one," Glenn said. I finished my plate, every bite. I complimented the casserole. I carried my dish to the sink, washed it, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Then I picked up my keys and walked to the door. They thought I was bitter. I was counting days. I drove 32 minutes home in the dark, with both hands steady on the wheel and a number in my head. 21. That was how many days remained before my brother's final payment on his marina loan came due. And I had already decided I would not say a single word to stop what was going to happen when that deadline arrived. But before I tell you what I knew about the ground and the deadline, I need to tell you about the man who taught me that houses never lie, and the one house that proved him right. I work in damage. That is the simplest way to say it. My official title is Storm Damage Insurance Appraiser, which means I walk into houses after hurricanes and tornadoes and explain, in dollar amounts, what the wind took and what the owner was already pretending not to see. I have stood in kitchens in Fort Myers with 3 inches of black mold growing behind the drywall, while a homeowner in a polo shirt swore the house was fine before the storm. The house was never fine. He just needed it to be. A house will tell you everything that happened to it. Every crack is a sentence. Every buckle in the subfloor is a paragraph. Every shifted beam is a confession the owner didn't want to make. My job is reading those confessions with a clipboard and a flashlight and a pen that clicks every time I find another lie someone papered over. I have crawled through attics in August heat so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel, and I have knelt on flood-warped joists with grit on my lips and salt air burning my throat, and not once has a house lied to me. People lie about houses constantly. The houses themselves never do. I am telling you about my job for a reason. Because everything that happened next, I saw coming the way I see a cracked sill plate behind fresh paint. My family thought I was emotional. I was diagnostic. My husband understood this before I did. He said it differently, though. Everett Calloway was a Finnish carpenter, 37 years old the last year I had him, with hands that could read a surface the way some men read weather. He could run his palm across a door frame and tell you within a 1/16 of an inch whether it was plumb. He noticed everything: crooked tile lines, settling cracks that other carpenters caulked and forgot, the way a floor creaked differently in March than in July, because the clay beneath the foundation swelled with snowmelt and shrank when summer dried it out. In 2018, he bought a lot on Lake Winslow in Moultonboro, New Hampshire. It was the worst parcel on the water. Marine clay soil, a slope that drained toward the foundation line instead of away from it, and a price so low that every contractor in the county had passed on it at least twice. Everett wanted it for exactly that reason. "Everyone walked away because the clay moves," he told me, standing on the lot in work boots and a flannel with sawdust still in the cuffs. Golden afternoon light sat on the lake behind him like something poured. Cheap land with an honest problem is better than expensive land with a hidden one. He built that cabin the way he loved me. Quietly, deeper than anyone could see from the outside, and on ground nobody else believed was worth the trouble. He hand-poured footings twice as deep as code required. He installed a drainage system beneath the porch that no inspector would think to look for, because no inspector would expect a Finnish carpenter to think like a structural engineer. When I asked him why the footings were so deep, he didn't blink. Code is a minimum, not a promise. We spent weekends there for 3 years. He worked on it after his regular jobs, evenings and Saturdays, sanding and fitting and leveling things that were already level enough for anyone else. I would sit on the porch with thermos coffee and watch the lake turn copper at dusk, while he measured something for the 4th time inside. Sometimes he would come out and press his palm flat against the porch boards like he was taking the house's pulse. "The house is telling its truth, Nor," he said once. "We just have to listen." But Clay doesn't forgive. He knew that. By 2019, the east wall had developed a hairline crack that grew a millimeter every season. He tracked it in a notebook. He called an engineer. He started saving money in an envelope he kept in the kitchen drawer, cash and bank deposits month after month, for a proper underpinning job that would stop the shifting once and for all. He said he would fix it right before anyone else ever stepped foot inside. He wrote the plan down in that notebook. Measurements, costs, a timeline, everything. His handwriting was small and precise, the way a man writes when he knows exactly what he is saying and wants to make sure the page remembers. He said he would fix it one day. That day never came. A scaffold did instead. I did not know about the notebook until much later. By then, someone had already stepped inside the cabin, paid $250,000 in cash, and never once looked beneath the floor. They bought a house that was still talking, still confessing, still telling the truth about what was wrong with its bones. But nobody was listening anymore, because the only man who knew how to hear it was gone. And the family he left behind had already decided that the house was worth more silent than honest. The call came on a Tuesday in October 2021, mid-afternoon, while I was sitting in a rental car filling out a hail damage report in a strip mall parking lot outside Tallahassee. A number I did not recognize, a voice I did not know. And the strange thing is, I finished the report before I drove to the hospital, because my hands had not caught up with what my ears already knew. He fell from scaffolding at a commercial site in Meredith. A Finnish carpenter doing trim work on a bank renovation, 32 feet up on a platform that shifted when a bracket failed. They told me he was gone before the ambulance arrived. I do not believe that. Everett checked his work twice. He would have held on. I drove to the hospital anyway because nobody told me what else to do. I parked in the emergency lot and sat with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold and tasted like metal and salt. A nurse came out and confirmed what the voice on the phone had already said. I signed papers. I drove home. I did not cry in front of anyone because I am the kind of woman who finishes the hail report first, and that is not a compliment. The cabin passed to me through right of survivorship. His name and mine were both on the deed, and when one name stops breathing, the other name absorbs the whole weight. I went to the county clerk's office in Moultonborough on a Thursday morning. Fluorescent light, laminate counter, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who processed the transfer in 40 minutes. 37 years of a man's life, and the paperwork to remove his name took less time than an oil change. I did not cry at the window. I cried in the car afterward, holding a deed that now had only my name where two used to fit, and the paper felt lighter than it should have, as if his half of the ownership had actual mass, and now the document was just floating in my hands. I need you to understand something. When people say grief gets easier, what they mean is you get better at faking the parts that make other people uncomfortable. You learn which face to wear at the grocery store. You learn how to answer, "How are you?" without making the asker regret the question. You learn to sleep on your side of the bed even though the whole mattress is yours now, because crossing that invisible line in the dark feels like stepping into a room where someone died, which is exactly what it is. I moved into the cabin the week after the funeral. I told myself it was practical. The lease on our Concord apartment was month to month, and the cabin was paid off, and it made financial sense to live in the house that was already mine. But a house built by the man you loved does not let you forget him. His coffee mug still hung on the third hook, the one closest to the stove. His boot prints were still pressed into the mat by the front door, two ghostly ovals that I stepped around every morning like they were holy ground. The kitchen drawer stuck the way it always had, and every time I yanked it open, I heard the specific rhythm of his wrist, that quick double pull he'd perfected, and my wrist could not replicate it no matter how many times I tried. Have you ever tried to sleep in a house that still smells like someone who is not coming back? The pillows held sawdust and coffee and something else underneath, something warm and specific that I could not name and could not wash out and could not bear to keep breathing night after night. I lasted 11 days. 11 mornings reaching for the wrong side of the bed. 11 evenings eating at a table set for one in a kitchen built for two. On the 12th morning, I packed one bag, locked the front door, and drove to Concord. I rented an apartment on the second floor of a converted Victorian near the State House. I told myself I would come back when I could breathe inside those walls without borrowing air from a man who no longer had any to give. Every Friday, I drove back to check the property, walked the perimeter, tested the locks, ran the water so the pipes would not freeze. And every Friday, as I pulled into the gravel drive, the porch light was already on. Everett had wired it to an automatic timer years ago so I would never come home to a dark house. That was the kind of thing he did. Small kindnesses buried in the wiring, invisible until you needed them. That porch light was the last promise he kept. A small, bright lie that said someone was still waiting inside. It clicked on at 6:14 every evening, rain or snow or nothing. It shone across an empty porch and an empty driveway and a door that no one opened. I thought that light was keeping the house safe for me. What I did not realize was that it was also telling everyone on the lake road exactly which nights the cabin was empty. 6 nights a week, that light burned for no one. And my family, I would later learn, had been watching that pattern for much longer than I knew. When exactly does a family decide which child will carry the weight and which child will be carried? Is there a meeting, a vote, a ceremony with candles? Or does it just happen so slowly that by the time you notice, you have already been doing it for 30 years, and everyone, including you, has forgotten it was never your choice? I did not know my family was watching the cabin. I did not know they had been tracking my Friday visits and my Saturday departures and the 6 dark nights between them. But I should have, because they had been watching me my whole life, measuring exactly how much I could hold before I set something down, and I had never once set anything down. I was 7 the first time. Kyle was 4 and wanted a toy at the hardware store, and I gave him my birthday money because he cried louder than I could say no. My mother knelt beside me in the aisle and pressed my hair behind my ear and whispered, "You've always been the strong one, Nora. Your brother needs you." I was 7. I had been alive for 7 years, and already the label was sewn in. At 14, I skipped summer camp, so Kyle could attend hockey school in Manchester. My father drove him there on a Sunday morning and came back smelling like drive-through coffee and satisfaction. "It's one summer," Glenn said when I asked. "Kyle's got real talent. You'll have other summers." I did have other summers. I spent them working at a bait shop near Winnisquam, saving for a car Kyle would eventually borrow and return with a dent he never mentioned. At 22, I co-signed his first auto loan. He defaulted in 4 months. I paid it off in 11. He never mentioned it again. Neither did my parents. That is how it works. The strong one absorbs, and the family forgets. The debt disappears not because it was repaid, but because everyone agreed, silently, that it was never really a debt at all. It was just what I did. It was just who I was. Nobody ever told me that putting myself down was optional. They just kept handing me heavier things and calling it a compliment. My mother used that phrase like a lullaby. "You've always been the strong one." She said it when I helped pay for Kyle's marina training program. She said it when I handled Everett's funeral arrangements alone because Kyle was too upset to help, and Glenn said he wasn't good with that sort of thing. She said it so many times that I stopped hearing it as a sentence and started hearing it as a name. If you are watching this, and you are the one in your family who always gets the phone call when something breaks, you already know exactly what I am describing. And you already know it does not end with a thank you. It ends with a bigger request, delivered with the same soft voice, wearing the same grateful smile, because the system only works as long as the strong one believes the compliment is real. By March of 2024, I had spent nearly 3 years commuting between grief and an empty cabin. Then a contract came through from a firm in Fort Myers. 4 months of hurricane damage assessments along the Gulf Coast. Good money, steady work, a reason to leave New Hampshire that had nothing to do with a kitchen drawer. I still could not open without hearing my husband's hands. I took it. But before I flew south, I drove to my parents' house in Laconia with a cabin key and a single sheet of paper. The limited power of attorney was explicit. I sat at the kitchen table with Glenn and read every line aloud. Utility payments, minor repairs, emergency maintenance if a pipe burst or a tree fell. Nothing else. The form said limited scope in bold print at the top, and I pointed to it with my pen before I signed. This is only for the water bill and if something breaks, I said. Nothing else. It says so right there. Glenn took the key from the table. His thick fingers closed around it, and for a moment, the brass disappeared entirely inside his fist. He squeezed my shoulder with his other hand. Warm. Firm. The grip of a father who has always been larger than his daughter and has never once doubted that this made him right. Of course, sweetheart. Don't worry about a thing. I heard a promise. He heard permission. We were both listening to the same 5 words and hearing completely different futures. I handed my father a key and a single sheet of paper and drove south the next morning, and I swear I felt lighter before I even reached the highway. Like setting down a suitcase I had been carrying since I was 7 years old. The airport hummed with departures, and I was one of them. Walking toward a gate with a contract in my bag and a quiet relief I had not felt in years. 8 weeks later, my phone rang. I was standing in a parking lot full of hurricane debris in Fort Myers, and it was not a storm that had torn something apart this time. It was a retired librarian who lived 3 houses down from my cabin on Lake Winslow, telling me in a careful, steady voice that there was a sold sign in my yard and a lockbox on my front door. I was kneeling in a stranger's kitchen in Fort Myers, measuring water damage along a baseboard that had buckled like a broken spine when Bet Hewitt's name lit up my phone. Bet was 68, a retired librarian who had lived 3 houses down from our cabin on Lake Winslow since before Everett mixed his first batch of footer concrete. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed things. Which cars turned onto the lake road, which porch lights were on, which ones were not. Nora, honey, there's a sign in the yard, she said. Her voice was thin and careful, the way people talk when they know the words are going to leave a mark. It says sold, and somebody turned off your porch light. I stood up slowly. My knees were wet from the flooded subfloor. The clipboard in my hand had a crack running down the middle of the assessment form I had been filling out, and I realized I was gripping it hard enough to bend the aluminum. Bet, nobody can sell that cabin. My name is on the deed, only mine. Well, somebody did, she said, because there's a lockbox on your front door and your father's truck was in the driveway last Tuesday. Glenn's truck. Not a stranger. Not a clerical error at the county office. Not a misunderstanding between real estate agents. My father, driving his blue Ford to my cabin, parking in my driveway, doing something with the key I had given him and the paper I had signed that was never, in any reading of the English language, permission to sell my home. I want you to picture this. You are on your knees in a stranger's flooded kitchen, 1,000 miles from the only house that matters to you. Your phone is telling you that your father just sold the last thing your husband ever built with his hands, and you cannot leave because 14 families in this zip code lost everything to a Category 4 hurricane, and you are the one processing their claims. Their roofs are gone. Their walls are open to the sky. Their children's bedrooms smell like mold and salt. You do not get to be the emergency that week. Bet kept talking. She told me the sign had appeared on a Thursday. She told me the lockbox was the combination kind, silver, bolted to the door handle. She told me the porch light. the one Everett wired on a timer so I would never come home to a dark house, had been switched off, and in 3 years of watching it glow every evening, she had never seen it dark. She said Glenn had been there twice that she saw, and once Kyle's car was parked behind him, and once there was a third car she did not recognize. I pressed the phone against my ear so hard the case left a crescent mark on my cheekbone. The gutted kitchen around me smelled like mold and wet drywall, and the plaster grit that coats everything in a hurricane house, and I tasted it on my lips, that chalky nothing, and underneath it, the flat metallic flavor of a body that has absorbed a shock and does not yet know what to do with it. What do you do when you cannot scream, cannot fly home, cannot call a lawyer at 5 o'clock on a Friday from a hurricane zone? When the only person who could have stopped this is the same person who did it, you do what the strong one always does. You finish the shift. Bet, I need you to do something for me, I said. I need you to write down everything you see at that cabin. Dates, times, license plates if you can read them. Don't talk to my father. Don't tell anyone you called me. Can you do that? Honey, I've been writing it down since the first truck showed up, she said. I knew something was wrong the minute that porch light went dark. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in that ruined kitchen with my clipboard in one hand and my phone in the other, and I laughed. Not bitter, not broken. The involuntary laugh of a woman whose body has done the math before her heart catches up. I was standing in someone else's destroyed home, cataloging someone else's loss, while 1,000 miles north my own loss was being wrapped in a lockbox and a lie. The irony was so clean it could have been structural, a load-bearing irony, the kind that holds up the whole building. I laughed. On my knees, with mold on my pants and betrayal in my ear and a clipboard I had gripped hard enough to crack. I laughed because the alternative was screaming inside a house that was not mine, about a house that no longer was. I filed 3 assessments that afternoon. I ate a gas station sandwich in my rental car and barely tasted it. I drove back to my motel with both hands steady on the wheel, and that night, lying on a rough bedspread under a rattling air conditioner with my phone face down on the nightstand, one thought kept circling behind my eyes like a slow-moving crack along a foundation wall. Whoever bought that cabin paid cash, closed fast, and never ordered an inspection. And I knew, the way I know a cracked joist from the pattern of a door that sticks in summer but swings free in winter, that the ground beneath that cabin held a secret my family never bothered to learn. 2 months I sat with that secret. 2 months of filing hurricane claims and driving Florida highways and lying awake in motel rooms, knowing the ground beneath my cabin held something no one in my family had ever bothered to understand. When the contract ended in late June, I booked the first flight to Manchester and drove past my apartment, past my parents' house, past every place that might have asked me a question I was not ready to answer. I drove straight to the cabin. The gravel crunched the same way it always had. The lake was flat and silver in the last light. Everything along the road looked the way it was supposed to look. And then I saw the porch, and everything stopped looking right at all. The plant was the first thing. Everett had potted it the week we moved in, a Boston fern in a glazed ceramic pot he found at a yard sale in Meredith. Nothing fancy, just something green by the door to prove somebody lived here and cared enough to water it. The fern was brown now, collapsed into a dry knot of dead fronds, and the soil had pulled away from the edges of the pot like it was trying to leave too. The porch light was off. In 3 years, it had never been off. Everett had wired that timer into the junction box himself, and it clicked on every evening at 6:14 whether anyone was home or not. Someone had gone into the electrical panel and switched it off deliberately. Someone had decided that the last small thing my husband left running in this world was inconvenient. A lockbox on your own front door is a strange thing. It does not look like theft. It looks like real estate. Silk combination style, bolted around the handle with a rubber grip so it would not scratch the finish. Professional. Ordinary. The kind of thing you see on every third house in a subdivision and never think about. But when it is your door, and your dead husband built the frame it hangs from, it looks like a fist closed around something stolen. I put my key in the deadbolt. It fit. It turned. But the lockbox held the latch plate shut, and the door would not open. I stood there with my hand on a knob that recognized me, and a lock that obeyed me, and a metal box that did not care about either. And for a moment, I could not move. I sat down on the front steps. The concrete was cold through my jeans. Late June in New Hampshire, and the steps were cold, and I thought that even the house knew something was wrong. The air smelled like pine needles and lake water, and the absence of sawdust, which used to drift through the open windows on weekends when Everett was sanding something inside. That absence had a smell. It smelled like a room where a sound has just stopped and the silence hasn't finished settling. If you have ever scrolled through photos of your own home listed for sale without your permission, you know the feeling. It is not anger first. It is vertigo, like the floor tilted and nobody told you. I pulled out my phone and searched the address. The listing was still cached, though it showed as sold. 12 photos. Someone had staged the rooms, new towels on the bathroom rack, a bowl of fake lemons on the kitchen counter I had tiled with Everett one August weekend, prying each square of travertine out of a mesh sheet and pressing it into thinset while he read the spacing measurements aloud. The counter looked clean and blank and completely emptied of everything that had happened on it. But they missed the drawer. Photo 11. A wide-angle shot of the kitchen from the doorway meant to make the room look larger than it was. And there, in the bottom right corner, the drawer that always stuck unless you lifted and pulled at the same time, the way only Everett and I knew how. A brown edge poked out, a notebook corner, and along that visible strip, if you zoomed in the way only someone who had memorized that handwriting would think to do, you could see his letters. Small, precise, the penmanship of a man who measured twice because he believed things deserved to be correct. I did not cry on those steps. I want you to remember that, because when the tears finally came, they were not about what was taken. They were about what was left behind. I closed the app. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. I sat on the cold concrete and watched the lake go black, inch by inch, until the only light on the whole road came from Bet Hewitt's kitchen window, glowing warm and yellow through the trees next door. The notebook was still in the drawer still stuck. And whoever had sold this cabin, whoever had staged the towels and the fake lemons and switched off the porch light and bolted a lockbox to my husband's doorframe, had no idea that the most important thing inside was not the view or the dock or the 4 walls Everett built. It was a dead man's handwriting in a brown notebook that nobody had bothered to remove, recording a truth about the ground this house stood on that was about to cost someone every dollar they paid for it. I did not try to enter the cabin that night. The notebook could wait. The lockbox was not going anywhere, and neither was the truth inside that drawer. But my family did not know that, and 3 days later, I walked into my parents' kitchen for what they called a welcome home dinner, and what I understood to be something else entirely. The table was set for 4. Diane had made pot roast, the Sunday version with the red potatoes and the carrots cut on the diagonal. The meal she made when she wanted the kitchen to smell like everything was fine. Glenn sat at the head, hands folded, wearing the expression he wore when he was about to explain something he believed should not require an explanation. Kyle sat to his right, tanned and relaxed, with a glossy brochure resting beside his water glass like a place card. Glenn spoke first. He always spoke first. The cabin was sitting there rotting, Nora. You weren't using it. The taxes were piling up. We made a practical decision for the family. I used that voice. The reasonable register. Low, steady. The tone of a man who had supervised municipal water pipes for 3 decades and believed that all problems flowed downhill and all solutions flowed from him. It was the voice that made you feel like disagreeing was not just wrong, but inefficient. Kyle leaned forward and slid the brochure across the table. It was heavy stock paper, full color, printed at a copy shop that charged by the page. Doc renderings, slip diagrams, a projected opening date. Revenue estimates that looked like someone had typed them in a large font to make them appear more substantial than they were. "Look, this is what it's becoming," he said. 32 slips, seasonal rentals, a bait shop with a patio. This is real. This is the future. He slid it toward me, the way a car salesman slides a financing agreement. I looked at it the way I look at a house with fresh paint over water damage, wondering what it was hiding. Have you ever sat at a table where everyone is smiling, and the food is warm, and the conversation is polite, and you are the only person who knows a crime was committed between the appetizer and the main course? You cannot scream. You cannot flip the table. You sit there, and you chew, and you watch them perform. And the pot roast tastes like nothing because your mouth has gone dry, and your tongue has turned into a thing that exists only to keep you from saying what you actually know. I ate. I nodded. I asked a few questions about the marina timeline that I already knew the answers to, just to watch Kyle's confidence inflate. Diane refilled my water glass twice without being asked, which was her version of an apology that never included the word sorry. Glenn watched me the way he used to watch pressure gauges, looking for the reading that meant something was about to blow. I did not blow. I finished the pot roast. I thanked my mother for the meal, and then I went home and waited 2 days. On Tuesday evening, I drove back alone. Glenn opened the door, and I did not step past the hallway. I kept my coat on. I kept my keys in my hand. "I want to see the closing documents," I said. "All of them. The purchase agreement, the deed transfer, the disbursement sheet." Glenn's face did something complicated. Surprise, then calculation, then a settling into the prepared version of himself. He turned without a word and walked to his office. I heard a desk drawer slide open. He came back carrying a manila folder. It was tabbed, color-coded. The spine was creased from handling. "I figured you'd ask," he said. He had the folder ready. That is the detail that changed everything. Not the sale, not the brochure, not the reasonable voice, or the pot roast, or the projected revenue from 32 boat slips. The folder, pre-tabbed, color-coded, waiting in a desk drawer like a defendant's exhibit. My father had not panicked when I asked for the paperwork. He had anticipated it. He had organized his evidence the way a man organizes his defense when he knows what he did and expects to be questioned about it. This was not impulsive. This was rehearsed. I took the folder. I did not sit down. I stood in his kitchen doorway with my coat buttoned and the overhead light buzzing faintly, and I opened it and began to read the way I read a damage report. Not looking for what was there, looking for what was missing. I stood in my father's kitchen, reading the autopsy of my own home. Cause of death, family. Method, paperwork. Time of death, while the owner was away on her knees in a stranger's flooded kitchen, saving other people's houses. Page 1 was the listing agreement. Page 3 was the purchase and sale. Page 5 was the buyer's proof of funds. And on page 6, beneath a wire transfer confirmation, I found the number that turned my grief into something with teeth. $248,000. I did not need a comparable sales analysis to know what that cabin was worth on the open market. I had spent my career pricing damaged properties. I could estimate a lakefront home in my sleep. That cabin, even with the foundation issue only I knew about, was worth at minimum $385,000. My father had sold it for $137,000 less than its value. Cash. Fast close. No inspection. No agent commission. No questions. I turned to page 7. Page 7 was the disbursement sheet. I read it standing in my father's kitchen doorway, with my coat still buttoned, and the overhead light buzzing, and the number from page 6 still burning behind my eyes. And what page 7 told me was worse. But first, I went back to the price, because a number like that deserves to be said out loud, in a room where the person responsible is standing close enough to hear it land. 3 comparable lakefront sales within a mile of the cabin, I said. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I speak to insurance adjusters when I am about to disagree with their valuation, which is to say, I spoke in numbers. A 3-bedroom on Birch Point closed at $377,000 last March. A 2-bedroom with a worse lot and no dock sold for $380,000 in October. And the Hargrove Place on the South Shore, similar square footage, inferior construction, closed at $395,000 in January. Those are public records. I can pull the MLS sheets from my phone right now. Glenn stood against the counter with his arms crossed. He had not moved since I opened the folder. The cabin needed work, he said. The buyer saw the condition and made a fair offer. The buyer waived the inspection, Dad. Nobody waives an inspection on a lakefront property and pays a fair price. They waive it because the seller is in a hurry and the buyer knows it. You accepted $248,000 for a property worth at least $385,000 on a conservative appraisal. That is not a sale. That is a clearance rack. I need you to hear this number clearly. $137,000. That is not rounding error. That is not market fluctuation or seasonal adjustment or a buyer who negotiated well. That is the exact distance between a fair sale and a family that wanted to close before the deed holder came home and started asking questions. Glenn's jaw worked once, the way it does when he is chewing a response he has not fully prepared. His coffee sat on the counter beside his elbow, untouched and cold, and the whole kitchen smelled like it. Stale, slightly bitter, the scent of a conversation that had gone on longer than anyone wanted. I did what I thought was best for the family, he said. You did what was best for Kyle, I said. Show me where the money went. I did not need to show me. I was already on page 7. 1 wire transfer, 1 transaction. The full amount sent the day after closing to an account listed in clean black type on bank letterhead. Callaway Marina, LLC. Operating account. Not a dollar held back. Not a dollar placed in escrow. Not a dollar deposited into any account with my name on it. Every cent of my dead husband's cabin converted into my brother's startup capital in a single electronic pulse. 1 wire. The whole amount. Not a dollar for the woman whose husband built the walls the check was written against. I looked at my father. He stood with his chin level and his shoulders square, and there was not a flicker of doubt anywhere on his face. Not shame, not apology, not even the decency of discomfort. That's family money, Nora, he said. It went where the family needed it to go. He said it the way you would say, the earth is round. No hesitation. No performance. He believed it. Glenn Callaway, 63 years old, retired municipal water supervisor, a man who had spent his career making sure pressure flowed in the right direction, genuinely believed that my husband's cabin was a communal asset and that he was the one entitled to decide where it flowed. He was not lying. That was the terrifying part. He was not even rationalizing. He had simply decided, somewhere deep in the architecture of his certainty, that what belonged to his daughter belonged to him first. When your father looks you in the eye and calls the money your dead husband earned family money and means it without a tremor, what exactly are you supposed to do with the part of you that still wanted him to be a good man? I closed the folder. I held it against my chest with both hands, my coat buttons pressing into the manila paper. I looked at Glenn leaning against the counter with his cold coffee and his crossed arms and his absolute conviction. And then something caught the edge of my eye and I opened the folder again. I flipped back to the signature page. Page 4. I had passed it too quickly the first time because I was looking at numbers, not names. But now the names pulled me back. There, at the bottom of the deed transfer, was my father's signature. I recognized it. I had seen it on birthday cards and tax returns and the power of attorney form I had signed at this very table 4 months ago. But beneath his name, in small typed letters that a person could miss, If she was not reading the way an appraiser reads a damage report, looking not for what is there, but for what should not be, were 3 words. With power of attorney, he had not just sold my cabin. He had not just priced it $137,000 below market and wired every cent to my brother's company. He had signed the deed transfer as me, my name in his hand, under a legal authority I had given him to pay the water bill. I closed the folder for the 2nd time. I did not say another word. I walked out of his kitchen with the folder under my arm, and he did not try to stop me. I said it so quietly that my father had to lean forward to hear me, and I think that scared him more than if I had screamed. "You signed for me, Dad." I held the signature page up between us. The overhead light caught the ink. His name in his hand, on the line that was supposed to carry mine, with those 3 typed words underneath that changed everything. "You put your name where mine was supposed to go, and you sold my house." Glenn's arms uncrossed for the first time since I had opened the folder. He reached for his coffee, realized it was cold, and set it back down. His hand stayed on the mug like it needed something to hold. "The paper said handle the property," he said. "I handled it, for the family. A limited power of attorney for maintenance does not authorize a sale. You know that. The form I signed says limited scope in bold at the top. You are authorized to pay the water bill and call a plumber if a pipe burst. What you did has a legal name, Dad, and it is not handling. It is a fiduciary breach. It carries criminal exposure, and I am done talking about it tonight." I watched his face change. Not guilt. Glenn does not do guilt. But something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, the look of a man who has been managing pressure systems his whole career and has just heard a valve he did not know existed. Let me be clear about something. My father did not think he was stealing. He thought he was managing. He thought he was doing what fathers do, which in his mind meant deciding where the family's resources went and expecting gratitude in return. That is the most dangerous kind of thief, the one who sleeps perfectly well at night because he has genuinely convinced himself that what he took was already his. I walked out with the folder under my arm. He did not follow me. He did not call after me. He stood in his kitchen holding a cold mug of coffee, and for the first time in 63 years, Glenn Calloway had no reasonable voice ready for what came next. A week passed. I filed no complaints. I called no lawyers. I let the silence do its work. Silence does in families that have made a habit of pretending. It sat between us like a wall that everyone could see and no one would name. Then I called Bet. "Has anyone been to the cabin since the sign went up?" "Not a soul," she said. "The lockbox is still on the handle. Same deadbolt Everett put in. Your spare key should still work, if it's where I think it is." It was where she thought it was. It was where Everett had kept it since the day he installed the deadbolt, under the ceramic pot on the porch, the one with the dead fern, tucked into a small depression he had carved into the concrete step with a chisel so the key would not slide. I knelt beside the pot and lifted it. The key was there, tarnished, cold, gritty, with 3 years of porch dust. Some habits outlast the people who made them. I stood at the door of my own cabin with a key to a house that was no longer legally mine, and I felt like the criminal. Isn't that exactly what families like mine count on? That the person they wronged will be too polite, too trained, too strong to do anything that looks improper, even when improper is the only door left open? I turned the key. The deadbolt released. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The staging was still in place. New towels on the bathroom rack, the fake lemons on the kitchen counter, waxy and absurd under the last light coming through the west window. An air freshener plugged into the hallway outlet, something floral and synthetic that sat on top of the cabin's real smell, the way makeup sits on a bruise. But underneath the lavender, I could still find it. Sawdust, lake water. The specific warmth of a house built by someone who cared about what went into the walls. I went straight to the kitchen. The drawer was exactly as I had left it 3 years ago. The same slight gap where it never closed all the way. I reached for it and pulled. It stuck. It always stuck. But Everett had shown me the trick on our second weekend in this kitchen. Lift the left corner with your palm, pull gently to the right, and the runner clears the warp in the frame. That drawer was the last lock he ever set, and he had given me the only combination without knowing he was arming me for a fight he would never see. The drawer slid open. There it was. A brown notebook with a water-stained cover and his handwriting on the first page. Dense and precise, dated 6 years back. Beneath it, a sealed white envelope, thick enough to hold cash, with 2 words written on the front in his careful hand, Foundation Fund. I pulled them both out and held them against my chest. The kitchen smelled like sawdust and absence and the faintest trace of the coffee we used to drink on the porch at dusk. And I understood, standing in a house I had broken into with a dead man's key, that my husband had been protecting me from inside a drawer I almost never opened. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet Everett built, and I opened the notebook the way you open a letter from someone who cannot hear you answer. The first page was dated 6 years ago. His handwriting, small and level, the letters of a man who believed that recording something correctly was a form of respect. He had written the date, the temperature, the humidity, and then a single observation. East wall, hairline crack, 1.2 mm at midpoint. Below that, a pencil sketch of the foundation cross-section showing where the clay met the footer. I had been tracking the house from the beginning. Page after page, season after season. Every March and every September, the 2 months the clay moved most, he measured the cracks with a dial caliper and recorded them in columns so neat they looked printed. The numbers marched down the pages like a patient's vital signs, and I could see the trajectory the same way I can see a buckling roofline from across a parking lot. The east wall crack grew from 1.2 millimeters to 2.1 to 3.4 to 4.0 over 4 years. Slow, steady. The kind of movement that does not announce itself until the day a door stops closing and a homeowner starts pretending it was always like that. Taped between the pages were photographs, close-ups of the cracks taken with a ruler held alongside for scale. I recognized the ruler. It was the steel one he kept in his tool belt, the one with the cork backing so it would not slide on a surface. He had documented the deterioration the way a doctor documents a chronic illness, precisely, patiently, without panic, because panic does not fix anything, and precision sometimes does. I told you the tears would come for a reason you could not guess. Now you know. I was not crying about what my family took from me. I was crying about what my husband had been quietly giving me for years, without ever saying a word. Folded into the middle of the notebook was a letter on engineering firm letterhead, a structural assessment from a company in Concord, dated 14 months before the scaffolding accident. The engineer described the clay composition beneath the foundation, the seasonal displacement pattern, and a recommended repair. Helical pier underpinning along the east and south walls. Estimated cost, labor and materials, $95,000. Everett had underlined that number once. No exclamation point, no note of despair, just a single clean line beneath the figure, the mark of a man who had seen the price and started doing the math. The math was in the envelope. I opened it with my thumb, and the flap tore cleanly, as though the glue had been waiting to give. Inside was cash. Mixed bills, mostly 20s and 50s, rubber-banded into neat stacks. I counted them on the kitchen floor with my legs crossed and my back against his cabinet, and my hands shaking in a way I could not stop. $31,400. Beneath the cash was a bank statement, a savings account I had never known existed, opened at a credit union in Meredith the same year he bought the lot. Balance, as of the last statement date, $48,000. Had been depositing small amounts for years. 200 here, 350 there. The deposits were irregular in size, but perfectly regular in frequency. One every 2 weeks, like a second mortgage payment running in reverse. $79,400. That is how much a Finnish carpenter can save in secret over 6 years when he skips every luxury and never once mentions why. He was $15,600 short of the repair estimate. Howe was still saving. He was still going. The last entry in the notebook was dated 2 weeks before he died. The handwriting was different, heavier. The pen pressed deep enough to leave grooves on the page behind it, and I ran my fingertip across those grooves and felt every letter like Braille. He had written one line, underlined once. Fix it right before anyone else steps inside. She deserves a house that holds. 7 words about me in a notebook I was never supposed to find until the work was done. He was planning to fix the foundation and hand me a solid house and never tell me it had been sinking, because that was who he was. He carried the weight alone. He carried it precisely. He carried it the way he carried everything, without asking for help, because he believed the people he loved deserved to stand on ground that did not move. 2 weeks later, the scaffolding gave way and he was gone, and the notebook stayed in the drawer, and the money stayed in the envelope, and the house kept shifting 1 millimeter at a time with no one left to measure it. I cried on that kitchen floor for 20 minutes. Not because my family sold the cabin, because my husband had been trying to save it, quietly, dollar by dollar, and he ran out of time before he ran out of love. Then I washed my face in the kitchen sink he had plumbed himself. I put the notebook and the envelope and the bank statement into Everett's old canvas field bag that hung on the hook by the back door. I zipped it shut. I walked out of the cabin with the bag over my shoulder and the spare key back under the pot. And I understood that my family had sold a ticking clock and called it a favor. And I had just inherited the only proof of exactly how loud that clock was going to ring. Here is something I have learned from 15 years of appraising damage. The first crack is never the last one, and the second crack always tells you more about the structure than the first. So when I found out my brother had been borrowing money from friends months before the cabin was sold, I stopped looking at the foundation and started looking at the marina. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Concord with a woman named Jill Breyer, a fellow appraiser I had worked a hurricane season with 2 years back. We were catching up, which for people in our line of work means comparing disaster zones and complaining about adjusters. The conversation was easy, the espresso was good, and then Jill mentioned my brother as casually as someone mentioning a weather forecast. Kyle hit up my husband for 10 grand back in February, she said. We said no. I figured you knew. I did not know. But I smiled and held my coffee and nodded like I did, because that is what appraisers do when the house starts talking. We stay quiet and let the cracks show themselves. Jill kept going. She said Kyle had approached at least 3 other people she knew of, asking for personal loans in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. This was in February and March, weeks before the cabin sale closed, months before the funds would have hit his account. She assumed it was bridge financing for the marina launch. She said it almost admiringly, like a man hustling to get a business off the ground. But I was not listening with admiration. I was listening with the part of my brain that calculates load-bearing failure. A legitimate business with $250,000 in confirmed startup capital does not require panicked personal loans from acquaintances 6 months before the money lands. You borrow from friends when the bank already said no. You pass the hat when the formal channels are closed. If someone you trusted told you their brand new business was fully funded, and then you found out they had been scrounging cash from friends for months before the funding arrived, what would you assume was eating through the money before it even got there? I thanked Jill. I finished my coffee, which had gone cold by the time I tasted it again. I drove back to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of me, and a new set of questions forming behind the old ones. The foundation was one crack. Kyle's borrowing was another. And the second crack, as always, told me more about the structure. That evening my mother called. Diane's phone voice has 3 registers. There is the church voice, pleasant and communal, which she uses for acquaintances and clergy. There is the comfort voice, soft and warm, which she uses when someone in the family is sick or sad. And there is the worried voice, which sounds like the comfort voice, but carries a different payload, because it is designed not to soothe, but to steer. She opened with the worried voice. Sweetheart, I've been thinking about you all week. Your father says you took the closing folder, and I just want you to know that nobody is trying to hide anything from you. She talked for 12 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the microwave. She talked about family. She talked about healing. She talked about how memories of Everett should be comfort enough without needing to hold on to physical property. Memories are comfort enough. That is what my mother said, as though you can heat a memory in winter, or lock its door at night, or pass it down to someone who never got to meet the man who built it. She talked about Kyle's ambition as though it were a virtue that required sacrifice from everyone except Kyle. She talked about the marina as though it were already built, already successful, already proof that the sale had been worth it. And then she arrived at the line she had been building toward since the first syllable. You've always been the strong one, Nora. Don't let bitterness make you someone you're not. Your brother needs you. There it was. The same leash with the same soft leather. 30 years of conditioning compressed into one sentence, delivered in the worried voice at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, calibrated to hit the exact nerve it had been trained to find. My hand was halfway across the kitchen table toward the phone, the old reflex rising, the muscle memory of a woman who had spent her whole life reaching toward the people who asked her to carry things. I stopped. My fingers hovered over the table surface. I pulled them back. I hear you, Mom. 4 words that sound like agreement, but work like a closed door. She never noticed the difference. She said she loved me. She said she would call again soon. She hung up, and the apartment went quiet, and I sat there with the notebook and the phone and the silence, and wrote 2 questions on the back of a gas station receipt I found in my jacket pocket. If the marina was fully funded by the cabin sale, why was Kyle borrowing money from friends months before the sale happened? And if the marina was not fully funded, where was the rest of the money already going? The pen scratched against the waxy paper, and the receipt curled at the edges, and the notebook sat on the table smelling like graphite and old paper, and a man who measured everything. I did not have the answers yet, but I had the questions, and in my line of work, the questions are the cracks, and the cracks always lead you to the truth. I did not have to wait long for the answers. The questions I had written on that receipt were still on my kitchen table when my father's text arrived at 6:47 the next morning. And after that, the answers started coming, whether I wanted them or not. Keeping the cabin won't bring your husband back. 8 words. No greeting. No sign-off. Sent at an hour when he knew I would be awake, because I had always been an early riser, and he had always known how to time a blow. I stared at the screen with my coffee in one hand and the phone in the other, and before I could decide whether to respond, the phone buzzed again, and again, and again. I had been added to a group chat. The thread was called Family Update. It included Glenn, Diane, Kyle, 2 aunts, an uncle, and 4 cousins I saw once a year at Thanksgiving. The messages scrolled back 3 weeks. 3 weeks of conversation that had happened without me, about me, while I was sitting in my apartment reading a dead man's notebook and trying to understand how deep the damage went. I read every message, 31 of them. My aunt calling the cabin, that eyesore on the lake. My uncle writing that Glenn had done the right thing and it was time to move on. A cousin I barely spoke to offering the opinion that widows who cling to property are stuck in grief and need professional help. Kyle had posted a link to the marina's projected revenue chart. Diane had written 3 separate times that she was worried about me. If your family has ever made a decision about your life in a group chat you were not invited to, and then added you afterward so you could see the vote was already unanimous, you know exactly how the air leaves your lungs when you scroll up and realize you are the only agenda item. I screenshotted the entire thread. I muted the notifications, and I noticed something. My hands had stopped shaking. Somewhere between the gas station receipt and message 31, the trembling had been replaced by something steadier and much more dangerous. I did not know what to call it yet. Later, I would recognize it as the moment grief finished becoming something else. 4 days later, Diane appeared at my apartment door without calling first. She was wearing the blue cardigan she wore to church, and she had a casserole dish in her hands, and her eyes were already wet when I opened the door. I let her in because I did not yet know how to not let her in. That reflex was older than any anger I had. She sat at my kitchen table. She set the casserole between us like a treaty offering, and then she told me about her childhood. I had heard pieces before, but never like this. Her voice cracked on the details. She told me about the house in Franklin where the heat got shut off every February because her father could not keep up with the oil bill. She told me about sleeping in her winter coat in her own bedroom, about putting plastic over the windows with a hairdryer, about eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week because the grocery money went to keeping the lights on. She told me her mother cried in the bathroom so the children would not hear, and that she could hear anyway because the walls were thin and cold, carry sound. Her tears were real. That is the part nobody warns you about. The manipulation works because the pain underneath it is genuine, and separating the two feels like cruelty, even when it is survival. I swore my children would never know that feeling, she said. Can you understand that? Everything your father and I have done has been to make sure this family never goes cold again. Her mascara had tracked 2 dark lines down her cheeks. Her hands were flat on my kitchen table, palms down, the way you place your hands when you are asking someone to trust you. Her perfume filled my small apartment, the same scent she had worn my entire life, and for a moment, I was not a 35-year-old woman with a stolen deed and a dead husband's notebook. I was a child sitting across from a mother who smelled like safety. And then she pivoted. You've always been the strong one, Nora. Don't stop now. Not when your brother needs you the most. My hand moved, halfway across the table, fingers reaching toward hers, the old reflex firing before my brain could catch it. The wood grain was smooth under my fingertips. I could feel the warmth of her hands from 6 inches away. Then I heard it. The turn. The precise moment where her real grief became my manufactured debt. The place in the sentence where understand became comply and strong became silent. I pulled my hand back and folded it in my lap. I'll think about it, Mom, she smiled. She squeezed my arm at the door. She left the casserole on the table. And that was the last easy sentence I would ever give my mother, because I meant it. I would think about it. But what I was thinking about was not forgiveness or family or letting go. I was thinking about a stranger in a dark sedan that Bet had mentioned the night before in passing. A man she had seen parked near the cabin 3 times that week, asking the neighbors questions. Not about the house, not about the property, about money. Bet Hewitt called me on a Wednesday evening with the kind of precision only a retired librarian brings to surveillance. She had dates, times, a description of the vehicle, and one detail that rearranged everything I thought I understood about what my family had done. The man drove a dark sedan, New Hampshire plates, mid-50s, clean-shaven, polite in a way that felt rehearsed. He had been to the Lake Road 3 times in 10 days, Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday again. He parked near the cabin but never went to the door. Instead, he walked the road, knocked on neighbors' doors, and asked questions. He talked to the Fosters across the road, Bet said, asked about the current property owner, asked about any outstanding financial obligations connected to the address. Not the house, Nora, Not the condition or the sale price, or whether anyone was living there. He asked about accounts. Did he say who he was looking for? He asked about the previous owner and the current owner. And then he asked if anyone named Calloway had other properties or business holdings in the area. She paused. He wasn't looking for your cabin, honey. He was looking for your brother. When a stranger shows up 3 times asking your neighbors about money and not about the house, you do not need a forensics degree to know what he is looking for. I had spent my career reading damage, and this was a damage pattern I recognized. This was a creditor's investigator. Someone was owed money, and someone had stopped paying, and the man in the sedan was mapping assets before the formal collection began. I thanked Bet. I asked her to keep watching. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table in Concord with my phone on one side and the notebook on the other, and a question that had been circling for weeks finally landing with its full weight. If Kyle's marina was fully funded by the cabin sale, why was a creditor's investigator driving around Lake Winslow looking for Calloway business holdings? Before I tell you what I found next, I need you to think about your answer to that question, because it is the same question I asked myself sitting at my laptop with my hands perfectly still. Drop your guess in one sentence. What do you think Kyle's marina really was? Because this is where everything turns. Please note, what follows contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. The lesson behind it is what I hope stays with you. I opened my laptop. The County Land Registry is a public database. Anyone with an internet connection and a name can search it. I typed Calloway Marina LLC into the search field and pressed enter, and the screen loaded in 6 seconds, and I understood in those 6 seconds that I had been looking at the wrong crack. The filing was a UCC lien and a mortgage encumbrance on the marina property, recorded in January. The cabin sale did not close until April. Kyle had pledged the marina as collateral to a commercial lender 3 full months before my father signed away my home to fund it. 3 months. My brother mortgaged his dream before my father had finished stealing the money to pay for it. The lender's name was on the filing in clean black type. Vance Gentry, Private Commercial Lending, Nashua, New Hampshire. I stared at the name and the date and the loan amount, and I felt the floor tilt the way it tilts in a house where the foundation has shifted and nobody told the people living inside. The cabin money did not build a marina. It serviced a debt. The glossy brochure Kyle had slid across the dinner table, the dock renderings and the slip projections and the bait shop with the patio. All of it was wallpaper over a hole that existed before the first dollar of my husband's home changed hands. Kyle had borrowed against the marina before it was operational, spent the money on something I could not yet see, and then convinced our parents to sell my cabin to cover the payments he was already missing. My parents had stolen from me to help my brother. My brother had stolen from them to help himself. And the man in the sedan was not a curious neighbor or a cautious buyer. I was the opening act of a collection effort by a lender named Vance Gentry, who had already done the math and found it short. I closed the laptop. The screen went dark. The apartment was silent in the way apartments are silent at 10 o'clock at night when you are the only person in them, and the only sound is your own breathing and the faint hum of a refrigerator that does not know anything has changed. I sat in that dark for a long time. 2 frauds stacked on top of each other like cracked foundations, one visible and one hidden. Both bearing weight neither could hold. My family thought this was about a cabin. It had never been about a cabin. It was about a debt that predated the theft, and a man with a folder who was not going to wait for anyone's family meeting to sort itself out. Vance Gentry was going to come collect. And when he did, every lie in this family was going to land on the same table at the same time. I was not going to wait for Vance Gentry to find me. I was going to find someone who already knew him and ask the right questions before my family realized I had stopped asking the wrong ones. I got Reese Latham's number from Bet, who got it from the marina's own website. Reese was listed under office manager, which told me everything about how deeply she was embedded in my brother's fiction. A veterinary technician by training, 29 years old, with careful hands and a habit of checking doors before she spoke. She agreed to meet me at Birch and Bean, a coffee shop on the quiet end of Main Street in Laconia. She was already in this corner booth when I arrived, hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from, sitting at the edge of the seat like someone who might need to leave at any second. When I slid into the opposite bench, she glanced at the door before she looked at me. I recognized that look. I had worn it myself every time my mother appeared at my apartment without warning. It was the face of a woman who had been living inside someone else's emergency for so long, she had forgotten what her own calm felt like. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. "I almost didn't. Kyle doesn't know I'm here." She looked at the door again. Afternoon light cut through the window and made the dust motes visible between us. Floating the way, debris floats after a wall comes down. "He told me it was temporary," she said. She did not need prompting. She had been waiting for someone to sit across from her and not require a performance. "He said once the marina opened, the revenue would cover everything. But the marina was already in Gentry's name before your father even listed the cabin." I watched him print that brochure, knowing it was fiction. "I want you to understand something about Reese Latham. She was not a villain, and she was not a hero. She was a woman who had been handed someone else's secret and told that keeping it was the same thing as love, and she had believed it just long enough to become complicit. I knew the shape of that trap because I had lived inside it for 30 years. The only difference was that mine was labeled family and hers was labeled loyalty, and from the inside, they feel exactly the same. She told me the boat charter came first, before the marina, before the brochure. Kyle had tried to launch a charter fishing service 2 years earlier with money borrowed from a private lender. It failed within 8 months. The debt rolled into the marina venture, which was supposed to be the recovery plan, except the recovery plan needed more capital than the debt would allow. That was when Kyle went to Glenn. That was when the cabin became the answer to a question nobody had asked me. "How much does he still owe?" I asked. "Enough that the lender hired someone to drive around asking questions. That should tell you everything." It did. The cabin money had not built anything. It had been poured into a hole that existed before my father ever took my spare key from under the dead fern pot. Reese's coffee sat untouched. Mine was black and bitter, and I drank it because I needed something real in my hands. The espresso machine hissed. A spoon clinked against ceramic somewhere across the room. And between those sounds, Reese leaned forward until I could see the tremor in her jaw. "He's going to ask your parents to make you sign something," she said. "A ratification. He thinks if the cabin sale is locked down legally, Gentry can't unwind it to reach the collateral. He's not trying to save the marina anymore. He's trying to make the paper trail disappear before the creditor follows it back to your family." End of August. That was the deadline. 2 weeks from the chair I was sitting in, every lie my brother had built was going to walk through a door he could not lock. "Kyle told me last week that Gentry gave him until the end of the month," Reese said. "After that, he goes public. Your parents' house, your family, everyone." She looked at the door one last time. Then she looked at me, and what I saw was not fear anymore. It was exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight they did not choose and has finally found someone who understands why they picked it up. I thanked her. I left money on the table for both coffees. I walked out into the August heat with my phone buzzing once in my pocket, the muted family chat I never checked, and a clarity that felt like the moment an appraisal comes into focus and you finally see the number the house has been trying to tell you all along. Kyle did not know I had the notebook. He did not know I had found the lien filing. He did not know that the woman he had listed as office manager on his fictional marina's website had just told his sister everything across a coffee shop table while checking the door for his shadow. And he had absolutely no idea that the one person he needed to sign a ratification was the one person in this family who already knew what every piece of paper was worth. Kyle needed my signature, and he did not know I already understood exactly what that signature was worth. But before I gave my family anything else, I needed to give the evidence to someone who could tell me what it meant in a language courts understand. The office of Hank Prescott smelled like old paper and settled arguments, and that was exactly what I needed. A room where problems had endings. He was 58, semi-retired, an elder law attorney who had spent 3 decades untangling the messes families make when money and love get confused. His office was small, second floor of a converted house near the State House in Concord, and the late afternoon sun came through the blinds in stripes that fell across his desk like lines on a legal pad. I set the canvas bag on the floor beside the leather chair and began laying things out. The closing documents with my father's signature and the typed words beneath it. The wire transfer confirmation. The public lion filing I had printed from the county database. Everett's notebook. The envelope. I placed each one flat on the dark wood and pressed the creases out with my palm, the way you lay out x-rays for a surgeon, and I watched Prescott read the diagnosis the same way I read a damaged house. He started with the foundation. He turned pages slowly. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. He made 3 notes on a yellow legal pad with a pen that scratched against the paper in the quiet room. And behind his chair, a wall clock ticked with the patience of a man who had heard worse. My father used a limited power of attorney to sell my cabin, I said. My brother used the proceeds to service a debt he had hidden from the family. The buyer paid well below market for a property with an undisclosed foundation defect, and the creditor has given my brother 2 weeks before he escalates. Prescott asked 3 questions. When did I sign the POA? What was the stated scope? Had I given verbal authorization beyond what was written? I answered each one. March 2024. Utility bills, minor repairs, emergency maintenance. No. He leaned back. The leather chair creaked. He took off his glasses and set them on top of the notebook as though he were placing a bookmark. I need you to hear what he said next, because it is the sentence that changed everything. Not because it was complicated, because it was the simplest thing anyone had said to me since Everett died. The power of attorney was limited in scope and exceeded in execution, he said. That makes the sale voidable. You do not need to sue anyone. You do not need to file a complaint or hire a litigator or stand in a courtroom. You just need to refuse to validate what was done without your consent. No signature, no ratification, no sale. I stared at him. That's it? That's it. The buyer can pursue your father for fraud if he chooses. The creditor will pursue your brother for the debt regardless. Those are their problems, not yours. You did not create them, and you are not obligated to solve them. He paused. Your brother's creditor will do his own work. The buyer will do his own work. You do not need to fight anyone. You just need to stand still and let the truth walk forward. Stand still and let the truth walk forward. I sat in that old leather chair with the canvas bag at my feet, and the evidence fanned across the desk, and a peppermint from the bowl dissolving on my tongue, sharp and clean. And I felt something I had not felt since the morning Everett mixed his last batch of concrete. The weight was lifting, not because someone had taken it from me, but because a quiet man in a small office had just told me that the most powerful thing I could do was the one thing my family had never in 35 years expected me to do. Nothing. For 35 years, my family told me I was the strong one because I carried things. Hank Prescott was the first person who told me I was strong enough to set them down. He walked me through the mechanics. If the family pushed a ratification, I would decline. If they threatened, I would refer them to his office. If the creditor contacted me directly, I would say nothing and forward the communication. The sale was voidable on its face. The only thing that could make it permanent was my signature, and I was under no legal or moral obligation to provide it. What about my parents? I asked. What about them? They'll say I'm destroying the family. He looked at me over the desk with an expression I can only describe as gentle precision. The family was destroyed the day your father signed your name on a document you never authorized. You are not the one holding the match. You are just the one who stopped pretending the house wasn't already on fire. I walked out into the August afternoon with the canvas bag over my shoulder and a clarity that felt like standing on level ground for the first time in years. The deadline was 12 days away. My family was about to discover that the only signature standing between them and total collapse was mine. And I had already decided where my pen was not going to land. 12 days. I knew because I had written the number on the bathroom mirror in dry erase marker, a habit Everett started when he was counting cure times on epoxy pours. 12 days until the end of August, and my phone had not stopped buzzing since 6 in the morning. The first message was not from Glenn or Kyle. It was a forwarded voicemail from Reese, and in the background I could hear my brother pacing. Gentry had shown up at the marina office at 7 that morning with a folder and a notary. He told Kyle the loan was accelerating, and the only way to stop it was a signed ratification of the cabin sale from the deed holder. From me. Kyle had not known Gentry had the cabin paperwork. I listened to the voicemail twice. In the background, Reese whispered, "He's been pacing since the guy left." Glenn's texts arrived in a 3-message volley. The first was reasonable. "We should talk as a family." The second was guilt. "Your mother hasn't slept." The third was a directive. "Sunday dinner, 5 p.m., no excuses." I set the phone face down on the granite counter. My coffee had gone cold, an oil-slick film across the surface. I counted my heartbeat. Then I picked the phone up again. Before Sunday, I spread everything on my bed. The notebook, the closing documents, the lean printout, Prescott's handwritten notes on the yellow legal pad. I photographed each page with my phone, backing up the evidence the way you back up a hard drive before a storm. Prescott's voice played in my head. "Stand still and let the truth walk forward." I rehearsed saying no in the bathroom mirror. But my reflection looked like Diane, jaw set the same way hers sets right before she cries. And for one terrible second, I could not tell which woman was the one who folds and which was the one who holds. Sunday, 5 o'clock, my parents' house in Laconia. The table was set for 4. Cloth napkins, the good plates, the rosemary and cheese casserole Diane only makes for holidays. I recognized the tactic by the smell before I recognized it by the logic. Childhood comfort deployed as emotional infrastructure for a manipulation dinner. A pen and a single-page document sat beside my place setting like a 5th course. Glenn stood at the head with his hands clasped behind his back. Diane was already seated, eyes wet. Kyle sat at the far end with his leg bouncing under the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. No one said grace. Glenn spoke for 6 uninterrupted minutes. He used the reasonable register, low and measured, the one that sounds like gravel wrapped in felt. He framed the ratification as a formality, just confirming what was already done. He mentioned Everett once. He'd want this family whole. Diane nodded at every sentence. Glenn slid the document closer to my plate. The pen followed, rolling slightly on the uneven table. I asked one question. "Where does the money go if I sign this?" Glenn's jaw worked. Kyle answered instead. "It's already gone. That's the point." The table went quiet. Then Kyle did something I had not seen since he was 15 and wrecked our father's truck. He pushed back from the table. He stood up, and he begged. Kyle Calloway, 31 years old, the golden boy, the one who had never in his life had to ask for anything because the family handed it to him before the request fully formed. He stood in our parents' kitchen with red eyes and a cracking voice, and he begged me. "I'm going to lose everything," he said. "The marina, the apartment, Reese. She's already halfway out the door. I know I screwed up, I know. But if you don't sign, Gentry takes the marina and comes after the cabin. We all lose." His voice broke on Reese's name like a stick snapping underwater. Diane reached for his arm. Glenn stared at the tablecloth because he could not watch his son do what he himself would never do. And my hand moved. I felt my fingers extend toward the pen. Nerve memory. I have signed hundreds of appraisal reports, thousands of damage assessments, and the muscle memory of reaching for a pen when a document is placed in front of you is deeper than resolve. My fingertips tingled. The pen was warm from sitting under the overhead light. I picked it up. I pulled the document toward me. The table held its breath. Diane's hand covered her mouth. Glenn leaned forward. Kyle stood frozen with his red eyes locked on the pen in my hand. And there, in the margin beside the notary seal line, printed in the legal description of the property, were words I recognized. Lot 14, Lake Winslow, and beneath the parcel number a notation Everett had filed with the county himself years ago. Foundation, post-tension slab on marine clay. See engineer's report attached. His handwriting. In the margin of the document my family wanted me to sign. A notation so small that 3 people had already signed past it without reading a single word. My husband's thoroughness, his insistence on recording every truth a house could tell, reaching up from the page and stopping my hand the way his hand used to stop mine when I was about to cut a tile at the wrong angle. My fingers were on the pen. The pen was on the paper. And Everett's words were right there in the margin, his last act of craftsmanship, waiting for the only person in the room who knew how to read them. The pen was warm from my grip, and Everett's handwriting stared up at me from the margin like a hand reaching through the page. I read the notation twice. Foundation, post-tension slab, marine clay, engineer's report attached. His words, filed with the county, printed into the legal description of the property my family was asking me to ratify. 3 people had signed past those words without reading them. I was not going to be the 4th. I set the pen down on the table. Not a slam, not a gesture. I placed it beside the document the way you place a tool back on the bench when the job is not right. Glenn started to speak. It's 1 line. I held up 1 finger. The room went silent. It was the first real silence all evening, and it landed on that kitchen like a change in air pressure. I need to read something first, I said. Kyle's voice came from across the table, tight and strained. What are you doing? What someone should have done before the closing. I did not explain. I did not argue. I pushed the document back toward the center of the table, stood up, and walked out of my parents' house without raising my voice or closing the door hard. The casserole was still steaming. The pen was still on the table, and 3 faces were frozen in expressions I had never seen before, because in 35 years of being the strong one, I had never once walked out of a room my father was running. The drive back to Concord took 40 minutes, and I used every one of them. The headlights carved a tunnel through the dark, and inside that tunnel I replayed the dinner and understood something I had not fully grasped while the pen was in my hand. When did being strong stop meaning I could endure anything and start meaning I could lose anyone? They were not asking me to forgive. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement, and no one at that table had acknowledged anything. They were asking me to forget, to sign a piece of paper that would make Everett's notebook irrelevant, his measurements meaningless, his savings unnecessary, his final written line about a house that holds into nothing more than the private scribbling of a dead man whose family had already decided his work was worth less than a boat slip. Signing that ratification would not save Kyle. It would erase Everett. It would take every page of evidence he had carefully recorded and render it legally moot, because once the sale was ratified, the cabin's history would begin with the buyer, and everything before would be a footnote no one would ever read. I could not do that. I would not do that. I pulled into the apartment parking lot and sat in the dark car for 5 minutes with the engine ticking, and the taste of cold coffee still bitter on my tongue from the mug I had never finished that morning. Then I went inside. The evidence was still spread across my bed, where I had left it before the dinner. Notebook. Closing documents. Line printout. Prescott's yellow legal pad notes. I gathered each piece and stacked them on the kitchen table. Then I opened the closet Everett's canvas field bag hung on the hook where it had been since I moved his things from the cabin. It was the bag he carried to every job site, olive green, heavy canvas, with a brass zipper and a leather strap worn smooth at the shoulder. When I pulled it from the hook, the closet exhaled a smell I had not been ready for. Sawdust and lake water, trapped in the fibers for 2 years, released now into my apartment like a voice from a room I thought I had closed. The canvas bag smelled like his job sites, and his weekends, and his hands, and I stood in my hallway holding it and breathing it in, and understanding that this bag was going to carry his truth the way it used to carry his tools. I packed it piece by piece. The notebook went in first, then the closing documents, the lien filing, the bank statement, the photographs I had printed from my phone, Prescott's notes. I set the notebook on top of the financial records, and for a moment my hands just rested there, palms flat against the cover, the way you would hold a Bible before swearing an oath. "You built the case, Ev," I said to the empty apartment. "I'm just carrying it." I opened the notebook one last time and read his final line. 7 words pressed so deep into the page that I could feel them with my fingertip. I closed it. I zipped the bag. The zipper teeth were loud in the silent apartment, a sound with the finality of a door locking. I set the bag by the front door. I picked up my phone and texted Prescott 2 words. "Not signing." Then I turned the phone off. The apartment went quiet for the first time in weeks. No buzzing, no family chat, no voicemails from anyone. I carried the bag to the bedroom and set it on Everett's side of the bed. The canvas settled into the mattress with a weight that felt right, and I lay down beside it in the dark. And for the first time since the scaffolding took him, I was not sleeping next to an absence. I was sleeping next to evidence. And tomorrow, my family was going to hear his voice for the first time since the funeral. I woke with the canvas bag beside me and a stillness in my chest that felt like the morning before a closing. I showered, dressed, drank 1 cup of coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and drove to Laconia with the bag on the passenger seat and Everett's voice in my head saying what he always said before a difficult job: measure twice. Glenn had arranged the living room chairs in a semicircle facing one empty seat. The ratification document sat centered on the coffee table with the pen uncapped beside it, positioned like a microphone waiting for a confession. 2 of his cousins sat near the window, witnesses, I realized, brought to give the proceedings the weight of family consensus. Diane was on the couch with her hands folded and her eyes already damp. Kyle sat in the corner with his leg bouncing, and Reese stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, not sitting with anyone, positioned like someone who had already chosen which side of the room she belonged on. I walked past the empty chair, set the canvas bag on the floor beside it, and sat down. I did not look at the pen. I did not look at the document. "We're all here," Glenn said. "Let's settle this like a family." "Good," I said. "I brought something the family should hear." Glenn ignored that. He had a script, and he was going to follow it. He stood at the front of the semicircle and made his case the way he had made it before, steady and certain. The voice of a man who believed that repetition was the same thing as truth. The cabin was sold. The money was spent. The ratification was a formality. Fighting would only make things worse. Diane added her line on cue. "Haven't we lost enough already?" "We have," I said. "That's exactly why I brought this." I reached down and unzipped the canvas bag. The sound of the zipper was loud in the quiet room, metal teeth parting with a rip that made Kyle look up from his hands for the first time. I pulled out the brown notebook and set it on my lap. Glenn's eyes moved to the notebook. He did not recognize it. None of them did. It was a carpenter's field book, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, water-stained at the corners and thick with years of use. It meant nothing to them. It meant everything to me. I opened it to the first page and I began to read. I read the dates. I read the measurements. I read Everett's observations about the east wall crack, tracked in millimeters twice a year, with the precision of a man who refused to let a house lie to itself. I read the pencil columns that marched down page after page, season by season, documenting a foundation that was slowly shifting on marine clay, while the family that would eventually sell it never once asked what was underneath. I read his handwriting aloud, and I heard his voice. Not the memory of it, the real thing, as if ink could hold a man's breath and release it years later into a room full of people who had never bothered to listen. The room went still. Glenn uncrossed his arms. Diane's hand moved to her mouth. The cousins by the window exchanged a look. Kyle stared at the notebook as though it were a weapon he had not known existed. I turned to the engineer's letter, folded between the pages. I read the assessment. Read the recommended repair. I read the estimated cost. Then I read the savings ledger Everett had kept in the back of the notebook, the meticulous record of deposits made over 6 years into an account none of us had known about. Cash in an envelope, a bank balance growing slowly and steadily toward a number he never reached. How was $15,600 short? I said. He was still saving when he died. Nobody spoke. The stale coffee on the side table sent up a thin curl of steam that no one had touched. Diane's perfume hung in the air, mixing with the faint smell of old paper rising from the notebook in my hands. My mouth was dry from reading without pause. I swallowed once and turned to the last page. The handwriting was different here, heavier, pressed deep. I ran my thumb across the grooves one more time before I read it aloud. She deserves a house that holds. The last line sat on the page like a headstone inscription. 7 words that carried more weight than every argument Glenn had made in an hour. The room absorbed them the way a cracked wall absorbs water. Slowly, deeply, with damage that would not show for days. I was about to explain what all of this meant for the sale, what it meant for the ratification document sitting untouched on the coffee table, what it meant for the family that had sold a house with a documented defect to a buyer who never knew. I opened my mouth to say the words I had rehearsed in the mirror. The doorbell rang. Every head turned. Kyle's face drained of color so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. He whispered one sentence, barely audible, directed at Glenn. "Don't answer that." Glenn looked at the door. Then he looked at Kyle, and for the first time all evening, my father looked afraid. The man on the porch did not knock twice. The moment Glenn cracked the door, he stepped through it the way a person steps through a door they have already decided belongs to them. Vance Gentry, 52, private commercial lender out of Nashua, wearing a dark blazer over a polo shirt and carrying a manila folder with the calm grip of someone who has done this before. He walked past my father without introduction, scanned the semicircle of faces until he found the one he wanted, and stopped in front of Kyle. He dropped the folder on the coffee table. It landed beside the unsigned ratification document, 2 white rectangles of paper, one a demand and one a plea, and neither one with my name on it yet. "I'm not here for a family meeting, son," Gentry said. His voice was flat and professional, the tone of a man who collects debts the way I appraise damage, without sentiment, by the numbers. "I'm here for the money that was supposed to land in my account 6 weeks ago." Kyle did not stand. His leg had stopped bouncing. His face was the color of the document on the table. "You weren't supposed to come here," Kyle said. "You weren't supposed to miss 4 payments. Gentry opened his folder and began laying out the timeline, and with every sentence, the room shifted beneath my family like clay in a spring thaw. The marina loan was originated in January. The cabin sale did not close until April. Kyle had pledged the marina as collateral and drawn against it months before the cabin money arrived. The proceeds from the sale, every dollar, had been applied to service the existing debt and its accumulated interest. The glossy brochure, the dock renderings, the 32 slips. None of it had been built. The money was gone before it arrived. Glenn turned to Kyle with an expression I had never seen on my father's face. It was the look of a man realizing he had been someone else's useful fool. 63 years of certainty, of sitting at the head of every table, of managing the family's direction like a pressure system he alone understood, and his own son had used him as a delivery mechanism for a fraud Glenn did not know he was committing. "You told me it was for the expansion," Glenn said. His voice was hollow. "You said the marina was clear." Kyle said nothing. His jaw was locked. His eyes were on the floor. "Kyle, is this true?" Diane whispered. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone. The cousins by the window exchanged a glance, stood quietly, and left through the kitchen. Nobody stopped them. Nobody even noticed. How many layers of lying does it take before the people doing it cannot remember which version they told to whom? My father lied to me about the sale. My brother lied to my father about the debt. And somewhere underneath all of it, my husband's notebook sat in my lap with the truth written in pencil, measured in millimeters, documented with the patience of a man who never lied about a house in his life. Gentry did not care about any of this. He was not here for the family drama. He pointed at the ratification document on the table and looked directly at me. "You're the deed holder," he said. "If you sign that, the sale stands and my lien transfers cleanly to the new owner. If you don't, this goes to court and everyone in this room has a problem." Glenn's voice came from somewhere small. "I didn't know about the loan. I swear I didn't know." I looked at my father, sitting in his own living room, with his certainty in pieces around him. I looked at my mother with her hand over her mouth and no words behind it. I looked at my brother, staring at the floor with nothing left to say. And I looked at Vance Gentry, who was watching me with the patient attention of a man who had already done the math and was simply waiting to see which column I would fall into. I closed the notebook. I slid it into the canvas bag and zipped it shut slowly, the way Everett used to close his toolbox at the end of a job. Slowly, because the work was done and there was no reason to rush. The zipper sounded like a sentence ending. I stood up. I placed the pen back on top of the unsigned document. I settled the bag's strap onto my shoulder. "I'm keeping the cabin," I said. "Not the story you tell about it. The actual cabin, with the foundation my husband tried to fix." I looked at Gentry. "You'll need to take that up with the people who signed without my permission." I walked to the front door. Nobody followed. Nobody called my name. The room behind me was full of people and completely silent, the way a house goes silent after a load-bearing wall has been removed and the structure is deciding whether to hold or to fall. I pulled the door closed behind me. I did not slam it. I let the latch catch with a soft click, the sound of a period at the end of a sentence I had been trying to finish for 2 years. Outside, the August air was warm and the street was quiet, and I could hear Gentry's voice starting up again through the closed door, steady and professional, and no one inside answering him. I left my family in that living room with a creditor and the truth, and I did not look back. What happened after the door closed was not my story to manage. For the first time in 35 years, I let someone else carry the weight. The strangest part of getting your life back on paper is how ordinary the paper looks. Prescott's office smelled like lemon furniture polish and old leather, the accumulated patience of a career spent untangling other people's messes. He slid the corrected deed across his mahogany desk with both hands, the way a doctor hands you test results that came back clear. My name in fresh black ink above the notary seal. No other names. No typed addendum about power of attorney. Just mine. Glenn's counsel didn't even push back, Prescott said. Once they reviewed the notebook and the exceeded POA scope, they advised mutual rescission. 48 hours. No courtroom, no judge, no discovery process. "It feels too easy," I said. He looked at me over his desk with that expression of gentle precision I was beginning to recognize as his version of kindness. "The hard part was everything before you walked in here." The deed was thinner than I expected. I held it up to the window and the afternoon light came through it, almost translucent, as though ownership were a thing made of tissue and faith. I folded it carefully and put it in the canvas bag. I drove home with the bag on the passenger seat. Gas station coffee in the cup holder, burnt and too sweet. The taste of an errand that changed everything. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and sat in the car for 20 minutes with the engine off. I thought about calling my mother. I did not call my mother. I thought about calling Kyle, and then I laughed at myself alone in the car, a short, dry sound, because some reflexes take longer to die than others. I went inside. I opened the drawer where Everett's notebook had lived before I took it to the family meeting. The drawer was empty now, the notebook in the canvas bag, the envelope spent, the bank statement filed with Prescott. I placed the deed inside, one man's care and one woman's name, sharing a space the size of a shoebox. The drawer slid shut with the same wooden glide as the day I first opened it, and the apartment went quiet around the sound of something finally being put back where it belonged. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of consequences. Bet called on Tuesdays and Thursdays, her voice carrying the Lake Road's news the way it always had, measured, precise, without editorial. She told me the marina sign came down on a Tuesday in early October. They did not replace it. Bare posts on the waterfront where the name used to hang. Gentry had exercised his lien and seized the property through foreclosure proceedings that moved faster than anyone expected, because Kyle had no counsel and no money to hire any. Kyle's initial investment was gone. The business license was revoked. The Laconia Waterfront Association removed his listing from their directory. The bait shop patio from the glossy brochure had never been built. The 32 boat slips existed only on paper, and now the paper belonged to a creditor in Nashua who would sell the property to someone who could actually pay for it. 9 days, Glenn had not left the house. The man who once drove 40 minutes to supervise a lockbox installation on my front door could not walk to his own mailbox. Bet mentioned it carefully, the way you mention a symptom without diagnosing the disease. Your father's truck hasn't moved, she said. Your mother takes the groceries in alone. I listened. I did not call. I did not drive to Laconia. I sat in my apartment with the deed in the drawer and the silence of a family that had finally run out of scripts. And I let the silence do what silence does when no one is brave enough to break it honestly. How do you mourn a brother who is still alive, but has never once in 31 years asked how you were without needing something in return? Bet answered that question for me on a Thursday evening in late October. She called with one last detail, delivered in the careful tone she reserved for information she wished she did not have. Kyle called your old landline number, she said. The one that still routes through my machine from when you moved to Florida. What did he say? He didn't say sorry, honey. He said deposit. He asked if you could lend him first and last month's rent for an apartment in Manchester. I was quiet for a long time. Bet waited on the line with the patience of a retired librarian who understood that some silences need to be held, not filled. That sounds about right, I said. Bet did not pass along my number. I did not ask her to. Kyle wanted rent money. Glenn had not left the house. Diane had not called. And I was sitting in my apartment holding a deed to a cabin I had not visited since the night I found the lockbox on the door. A house with a cracked foundation my husband had already started saving to fix. A house that was mine again, on paper, but still broken underneath. The same way everything was. The voicemail arrived on a Tuesday, 43 seconds of my father's voice pressed into digital silence. I played it once, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water I never drank. Glenn cleared his throat twice before speaking, the way he always did when he was about to deliver a sermon he hadn't rehearsed. He mentioned the weather. He mentioned that the furnace needed a new filter. Then, buried in the middle like a coin dropped into mud, he said the word, sorry. Not I'm sorry, just sorry, unattached to a subject, floating between a comment about leaf gutters and a reminder that the truck registration was due in December. 43 seconds, and the only word that mattered had no spine. I deleted it. Then I fished it out of the deleted folder and saved it, because proof has a way of mattering months after the moment passes. 3 weeks crawled by. The leaves in my neighbor Bet's yard turned copper and fell. I drove to work, wrote storm reports, calculated depreciation on someone else's roof, while my own life sat unappraised. Kyle had stopped calling after I refused his request for money. The silence from my parents' house in Concord was so complete it had texture, like wool packed into my ears. Diane, my mother, sent nothing. No text, no card, no casserole wrapped in foil with a note taped to the lid. 61 years of being a church administrator had taught her how to organize silence into something architectural. She built walls with it. She built rooms. I caught myself checking my phone at red lights, not because I expected her to call, but because the absence kept surprising me. You'd think a daughter would stop being surprised by her mother's quiet after 35 years. You'd be wrong. Every unanswered day was a small, clean cut, and I kept pressing the wound to see if it still bled. It did. The first frost came early that November, and I woke to a lawn that looked sugared. I made coffee in Everett's old percolator, the one with the dented lid he'd refused to replace because he said imperfect things brewed better. The cabin sat 2 hours north, untouched since the sale collapsed. I hadn't driven up. I wasn't ready to stand in a house that had been stolen from me and then returned like damaged freight. My phone buzzed at 7:14 on a Thursday morning. The name on the screen was Reese Latham, and for a moment I couldn't place why Kyle's girlfriend would be calling me directly. We'd spoken once at the family dinner that had turned into a tribunal. She'd handed me the wine. She'd watched. I left him, Reese said. No preamble, no small talk. Her voice was steady in a way that suggested she'd been practicing the sentence. Packed 2 bags and drove to my sister's place in Dover last night. I sat down on the porch step. The frost soaked through my pajama pants immediately, sharp and real. Are you safe? Safe isn't the issue. She exhaled, and I heard a dog bark somewhere behind her. I found the second appraisal, the one your father commissioned before the sale. Kyle had it in a folder labeled boat insurance, which is almost funny if you think about it. I closed my eyes. The number surfaced without effort. The cabin's true value had been nearly $140,000 more than what they'd pushed me to accept. Hearing someone else confirm it out loud didn't change the math, but it changed the weight. I should have said something at that dinner, Reese continued. When you were reading from the notebook and everyone was staring at you like you'd committed a crime, I knew. I'd seen the folder 2 weeks before, and I sat there and poured wine and said nothing. You handed me the bottle, I said. That counted for something. It counted for almost nothing, and we both know it. A pause. The dog barked again. I called because I wanted you to hear it from me, not from Kyle spinning some story about how I abandoned him. He'll say I left because of money. I left because I watched a family eat a woman alive over a kitchen table, and I held the silverware. I pressed my palm flat against the frozen step. 5 fingers, 5 points of cold, each one distinct. What will you do? Start over. Vet clinics hire everywhere. She laughed once, short and dry. At least now I know how much the truth weighs. I'd rather carry it alone than carry it with a lie. She hung up before I could respond, which was probably deliberate. Some truths don't need a reply. They need a witness. I sat on that step until the frost melted under me, until the wet seeped through to skin, until the coffee went cold in my hand. Reese had given me something no one in my own family had offered in months. Not an apology, not an explanation, just plain, undecorated honesty delivered at 7:14 on a Thursday like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Inside, the percolator ticked as it cooled. I poured the cold coffee down the drain and brewed a fresh pot, because some mornings deserve a second try. And somewhere in a folder labeled boat insurance, the truth had been sitting in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. The contractor read the notebook for 10 minutes before he looked up. He stood in the cabin's basement with his boots on bare concrete and Everett's handwriting open across his palms, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the careful tone of a man who'd just been handed something that deserved more than a quick glance. "Whoever wrote this knew exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it," he said. His name was Dale Whitford, a 54-year-old foundation specialist out of Meredith who'd been pouring helical piers for 3 decades and spoke about soil displacement the way some men talk about weather, plain, factual, without ornament. I'd found his number through a structural engineer my colleague Jill recommended, and when I called, I told him only that I had a lakeside cabin with a cracked foundation and a dead husband's repair plan. He turned another page. "This is 3 years of documentation. Most homeowners don't even know what underpinning means." "How is a Finnish carpenter?" I said. "He noticed everything." Whitford nodded once, the way tradesmen do when they recognize another craftsman's hand. Everett had sketched every crack with measurements dated quarterly, mapped the water table's seasonal shifts, calculated the load-bearing adjustments needed for each pier location. The notebook wasn't grief. It was a blueprint waiting for funding. He'd known exactly what the cabin needed and had run out of time before he could pay for it. Work began that same week in early December. I drove up from Concord every third day, 2 hours each way through towns whose Christmas lights were already strung across main streets I barely noticed. The crew arrived at 7 each morning, and by the time I pulled into the gravel drive, the mechanical hum of the pier driver was already vibrating through the floorboards. A deep, rhythmic pulse I could feel in my molars before I heard it with my ears. Fresh concrete and cold lake air mixed through the open basement hatch, and I stood on the porch drinking thermos coffee, black and strong, the taste of mornings that belonged entirely to me. 2 weeks. That was all it took to fix what 3 years of silence and one fraudulent sale had tried to bury. I watched the crew pour and brace exactly where Everett's drawings indicated. Each pier sunk into clay at the angles he'd calculated on graph paper while I slept in the next room, not knowing he was mapping our future one crack at a time. On the final day, Whitford pressed a spirit level against the east wall, the one with the 4mm crack that had started all of this, the fissure Everett had measured first and measured most. The bubble drifted, settled, held. The green line glowed in the thin winter light like a small, quiet verdict. "Level," Whitford said. "First time in a while, I'd guess." I touched the wall where the crack had been sealed. The surface was cool and smooth and absolutely still. Still. First time ever. This is what it looks like when a dead man finishes what he started. Not a ghost story, not a miracle, just good notes, honest math, and someone left behind stubborn enough to write the check. The check. I wrote it at the kitchen counter, the same counter where the listing photos had shown a dead plant in a ceramic pot, the same counter where my family had once sat and lied to me about what this place was worth. The repair cost $91,200. Everett's savings covered most of it, the money he'd set aside in 2 careful streams, one through the bank and one in cash, all of it now consolidated into a single account with his name still on the header. I covered the remaining $11,800 from my own appraisal earnings. I signed the check and set the pen down and sat there for a long moment in the silence of a house that had stopped shifting. His money fixed the foundation. Mine just covered what he ran out of time to save. For the first time since the funeral, we were working on the same project again. I called a locksmith the following week. He came on a Tuesday, a young man with a toolbox and no interest in small talk, which suited me fine. I had him change every lock, front door, back door, basement hatch. 3 locks, 3 new deadbolts, and when he asked how many keys I wanted cut, I held up one finger. No spare? No spare. He looked at me the way people look at someone making an obvious mistake, and I almost laughed, because it was exactly the expression my father wore when I refused to sign his document. That look that said, "You'll regret this," but I was finished living in a house where someone else held a key I didn't know about. One key, one pocket, one person who decides who walks through the door. I moved my things from the Concord apartment over 3 trips in my car. Clothes, books, the percolator with the dented lid. On the last trip, I set Everett's notebook back in the kitchen drawer where I'd first found it, face down, closed. The cabin was mine. The ground beneath it was solid, and from the kitchen window I could see the lake holding the last light of December, perfectly still. The way water looks when everything underneath has finally stopped moving. The pot where the dead plant had been left a ring on the porch boards. A perfect circle of grime that looked like a clock face with no hands. I knelt beside it in the first week of January with a bag of potting soil and a winterberry holly I'd bought at a nursery outside Laconia, and I dug the old roots out with my bare fingers because I hadn't reconnected the garden hose yet and couldn't be bothered to find gloves. The dead roots came out in dry clumps, pale and weightless, like something that had forgotten what it was supposed to become. I packed the new soil around the holly's root ball and pressed it down with both palms. Dirt edged under my fingernails immediately, cold and gritty and alive. Everett would have measured the drainage first, checked the pH, probably drilled a second hole in the ceramic for runoff. I just packed the soil and hoped. Some things don't need a blueprint. Some things just need someone willing to kneel in the cold and get their hands dirty. I watered the plant with a kitchen measuring cup. 3 trips from the sink, the water steaming faintly in the January air. And then I stood back and looked at it. The holly's leaves were dark green and waxy, built for frost. The red berries wouldn't come until autumn, but the branches were already holding their shape against the wind off the lake. It looked stubborn. It looked like it intended to stay. The listing photos had shown the dead plant 11 times. I'd stared at every image before I noticed Everett's notebook sitting in the background on the counter behind it. The plant had been dying in plain sight, while the evidence of everything sat 3 feet away, waiting. I thought about that as I wiped my hands on my jeans and went inside. The cabin was quiet in a way I was still learning to trust. I walked room to room as the afternoon light shifted. The east wall was sealed, the plaster smooth where the crack had run for years. The floors no longer sloped toward the lakeside. I could set a glass of water on the kitchen counter and it stayed centered, which sounds like nothing until you've lived in a house where everything slowly drifted left. I opened Everett's drawer. The notebook sat inside, face down where I'd placed it. The deed lay on top, folded into thirds. Beside them, the envelope that had once held his cash savings, the careful, quiet money he'd set aside over years, sat empty now, folded flat as a finished letter. I closed the drawer gently, the way you close a book whose ending you finally understand. The empty envelope looked like a chrysalis in there. Everything it held had already become something else, concrete and steel, and a foundation that read level for the first time since the cabin was built. Every room felt like a sentence he'd started, and I'd finished. The bedroom where he'd worked late into the nights I never heard him get up. The bathroom where he'd hung the mirror slightly too high because he always forgot I was 5'6", not 5'10". The kitchen where I'd sat across from my family and watched them try to take this place apart board by board, with paperwork and smiles. If you've ever walked through a house that someone you loved built with their hands, you know the walls hold things the way skin holds warmth. Not the facts, just the pressure. I could feel him in the levelness of the floors, in the tight joints of the window casings, in every corner that met at exactly 90 degrees because he wouldn't allow anything less. I was standing at the kitchen window when the porch light clicked on. A small mechanical snap inside the wall. then a yellow glow spreading across the wet boards outside. The automatic timer Everett had wired in 2019, 5 years ago, before the accident, before the funeral, before my family tried to sell my grief out from under me. He'd set it to trip at dusk, and it still did. 5 years later, it still knew when to turn on. Some things just hold. The light threw a yellow rectangle across the new plant and the freshly swept porch. And from inside the kitchen, the cabin looked occupied. Not haunted, not abandoned, not under siege. Occupied, lived in, chosen. I carried a mug of chamomile tea out to the porch and stood under that light with the key in my pocket and the taste of quiet on my tongue. The lake was black glass. The air smelled like cold water and potting soil, and the faint mineral edge of new concrete rising from below the cabin. I remembered the dinner. Kyle leaning back in his chair, smirking, saying the cabin had finally done something useful. He'd meant the sale. He'd meant the money. He'd meant stripping this place down to a transaction and splitting the profit among people who never drove a single nail into its frame. How do you thank a man who can't hear you? For a house that can't speak? For a truth that almost didn't survive long enough to matter? You stand on his porch. You drink your tea. You say it out loud to no one, because the lake doesn't judge, and the walls already know. It finally did something good, I said, just not for the family he meant. The porch light held. The holly held. The foundation held. And I was standing in the doorway of a house my husband built on the worst lot on the lake, holding one key, owing no one a single explanation, because houses don't lie, and this one had finally told the whole truth. I spent months believing that silence was the same as strength. I let my family sell the my husband built with his own hands, and I almost signed a piece of paper that would have made their betrayal permanent. My mistake was trusting that the people who raised me would never treat my grief as an opportunity. If someone in your life is asking you to stay quiet for the sake of keeping peace, please hear me. Peace built on silence is just a prettier word for surrender. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until the paperwork is already signed to start asking questions. Some people will call this a revenge story, and I understand why. A widow fights back, a family falls apart, and the ones who lied end up losing everything they schemed to take. But this was never about revenge. This was about refusing to let the truth stay buried in a kitchen drawer. The real revenge story is what happens when you simply stop pretending. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to burn anything down. You just need to hold the evidence and stand still. I believe God put me through this so I could learn that houses don't lie, and neither should the people who live in them. That is the lesson no revenge story can teach you on its own. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have signed that paper, or would you have walked away? Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than I can say. Some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling and reflection, but the heart of it, the message, is something I hope you carry with you.